Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the ocean's most incredible secrets, a discovery that's rewriting everything we thought we knew about how marine life communicates. You're floating weightlessly above a coral reef in the crystal clear waters of the Great Barrier Reef. Your scuba gear creating that rhythmic breathing sound that somehow makes everything feel more peaceful. The water around you is so transparent it's like floating in liquid air, and below you stretches an underwater metropolis more complex than any human city, and you definitely wouldn't survive this without your gear because you'd be holding your breath for the next 40 minutes, watching nature's most sophisticated communication network in action. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I love seeing how this community spans across time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're witnessing something that happens every second of every day, but remains completely invisible to human eyes. The coral reef beneath you isn't just a collection of pretty rocks with fish swimming around. It's a living supercomputer processing millions of chemical messages simultaneously. Each coral polyp, no bigger than a grain of rice, is both sending and receiving molecular mail through the water around it. These aren't simple chemical reactions either. We're talking about complex information systems that make our internet look like smoke signals. You drift closer to a massive brain coral, its surface covered in what looks like tiny flowers, but are actually individual animals working together as one organism. Right now, at this very moment, these polyps are releasing specific chemical compounds into the water, messages that travel to neighboring corals, with instructions about everything from when to spawn to how to defend against incoming threats. The water itself becomes the delivery system, carrying molecular packages that contain more information than you might imagine possible. Scientists have discovered that these chemical signals aren't random. They follow patterns as complex as any human language. Different combinations of molecules mean different things, like a chemical alphabet that spells out instructions for survival. Some messages tell nearby corals about water temperature changes, others warn about approaching predators, and still others coordinate the timing of massive spawning events that happen just a few nights each year across hundreds of miles of reef. You notice a school of parrotfish grazing on the coral nearby, their bright colors almost fluorescent in the filtered sunlight. What you can't see is that their feeding is triggering a cascade of chemical responses throughout the reef. The coral there nibbling releases stress hormones, chemical distress calls that spread through the water to alert neighboring polyps. Within minutes, corals dozens of yards away begin altering their behavior based on these molecular messages, some retracting their feeding tentacles, others changing their metabolic rate. The most fascinating part is that this chemical communication network extends far beyond just the coral themselves. Every creature living in and around the reef is both sending and receiving these molecular messages, creating an underwater internet that connects thousands of species in ways researchers are only beginning to understand. Fish, sea urchins, algae, bacteria, even microscopic plankton all participate in this constant chemical chatter that keeps the entire ecosystem functioning as one integrated system. Researchers still argue that we've only scratched the surface of understanding how sophisticated these chemical communications really are. Some marine biologists believe the reef operates like a single massive organism, with individual corals functioning more like cells in a body than separate creatures. The chemical signals flowing between them would be equivalent to the electrical impulses traveling through our nervous system, carrying information and coordinating responses across the entire reef community. You float here in the middle of nature's most advanced communication network, surrounded by conversations you can't hear, messages you can't read, and a level of coordination that makes human cities look chaotic by comparison. Every drop of seawater around you carries chemical information, molecular news, updates about the state of the reef, weather reports about changing ocean conditions, and social media posts from creatures sharing their daily experiences with their neighbors. You watch as invisible molecular messengers drift past your mask, each one carrying specific instructions that will determine whether nearby organisms thrive or struggle to survive. These aren't simple chemical reactions happening by chance. You're observing nature's most sophisticated postal service, where every molecule has a destination and every message has a purpose. The water around you moves like liquid mercury, carrying millions of these microscopic packages, each one programmed with information that could change the behavior of creatures hundreds of yards away. A small triggerfish swims past, and you notice how other fish seem to react before it even comes into view. What you're witnessing is the chemical early warning system at work, molecules released by the approaching fish that announce its presence, its mood, even its intentions to hunt or simply pass through the territory. These molecular announcements travel faster through water than sound, creating a communication network that operates at the speed of chemistry rather than the speed of light. The brain coral you were observing earlier continues its chemical conversation, but now you can imagine the complexity of what's happening. Each polyp releases dozens of different compounds simultaneously, creating chemical sentences that might translate to something like announcing current water temperature, reporting on available food sources, requesting assistance with waste removal, and updating neighbors about the structural integrity of the reef. The molecular mixture changes constantly as conditions shift, like a live news broadcast transmitted through seawater. You drift toward a section where the coral appears to be struggling, its colors slightly faded compared to the vibrant specimens nearby. This coral is sending out chemical distress signals, molecular SOS messages that contain detailed information about what's causing the problem. Maybe it's dealing with a bacterial infection, or perhaps water temperatures have risen beyond its comfort zone. Either way, its chemical cries for help are being received by organisms throughout the area. What happens next demonstrates the incredible sophistication of this underwater communication network. Neighboring corals begin releasing different chemical compounds, molecular medications that can help fight off infections, or chemical stabilizers that help regulate temperature stress. Cleaner fish receive the chemical signals and adjust their behavior, spending more time removing parasites and dead tissue from the struggling coral. Even bacteria in the surrounding water respond to these chemical messages, with beneficial microbes multiplying to help restore balance, while harmful ones are discouraged by natural antibiotic compounds released by the reef community. The molecular messages don't travel randomly through the water either. You notice that ocean currents carry them in specific patterns that maximize their effectiveness. The reef has essentially evolved to work with the natural flow of water, positioning chemical senders and receivers to take advantage of current patterns that have existed for thousands of years. It's like the coral have learned to use the ocean's circulation system as their personal mail delivery service, timing their chemical releases to coincide with optimal water flow conditions. You observe a fascinating example of this chemical timing when a large grouper approaches the reef. Long before the fish arrives, chemical warning signals begin spreading through the water, molecule by molecule, building a picture of the approaching predator for every creature in the area. Small fish receive these molecular alerts and begin altering their behavior, not fleeing immediately, but preparing for potential danger. Sea urchins detect the chemical warnings and adjust their position, while crabs scuttle towards safer hiding spots based entirely on molecular information traveling through the seawater. The grouper itself is both sending and receiving chemical signals as it approaches. Its presence releases specific molecular signatures that identify it as a particular individual, not just another large fish. The reef community has a chemical memory of this grouper, knowing whether it typically hunts aggressively or moves through peacefully. Previous encounters have been recorded in the molecular memory of the reef, creating a chemical database of individual fish personalities that influences how the community responds to return visits. Researchers still argue that these chemical communication systems might be far more advanced than we currently understand, with some suggesting that the molecular messages contain layers of information similar to digital data compression. A single chemical compound might carry multiple meanings depending on its concentration, the time of day it's released, what other molecules accompany it, and even the specific location where it originates. The reef essentially speaks in chemical paragraphs rather than simple molecular words. You're beginning to understand that every movement you make through this water is disrupting thousands of ongoing chemical conversations, like walking through a library while people are trying to whisper important messages to each other across the room. Your presence adds new molecular signatures to the water, foreign chemical compounds from your breathing apparatus and equipment that the reef community must interpret and respond to, treating you as just another participant in their endless chemical dialogue. You focus your attention on the microscopic partnership that makes this entire chemical communication network possible, drifting closer to examine what looks like tiny golden specks scattered across the coral surface. These aren't decorations or random particles. You're looking at zooxanthellae, single-celled algae that have been living inside coral polyps for over 200 million years in one of nature's most successful business partnerships. Each coral polyp hosts millions of these microscopic tenants, and their chemical conversation is so constant and complex, it makes human relationships look simple by comparison. The partnership operates on molecular rent payments that happen every second of every day. The algae lives safely inside the coral's tissues, protected from predators and harsh ocean conditions, while they use sunlight to produce sugar through photosynthesis. But here's where the chemistry gets interesting. The algae don't just make sugar for themselves, they produce far more than they need and share the excess with their coral hosts through carefully regulated chemical transfers that have been perfected over millions of years of evolution. You can almost imagine the molecular negotiations happening inside each polyp as algae and coral coordinate their daily energy exchange. The coral provides the algae with carbon dioxide, nitrogen compounds, and phosphorus, essentially feeding them the raw materials needed for photosynthesis. In return, the algae hand over up to 90% of their sugar production, keeping just enough to maintain their own cellular functions while providing their hosts with the majority of their nutritional needs. This chemical partnership becomes even more fascinating when you consider how the two organisms coordinate their activities through molecular timing signals. The algae need sunlight to produce sugar, so they communicate chemically with their coral hosts about optimal positioning for light exposure. The coral responds by adjusting the orientation of its polyps and even the transparency of its tissues to maximize the amount of sunlight reaching the algae inside. It's like having a solar panel that can negotiate with the battery about the best angle for energy collection. You notice how the coral's colors shift subtly throughout the day, and this isn't just a visual effect, it's a chemical response system in action. The zooxanthellae produce different colored compounds depending on light intensity, water temperature, and nutrient availability. These color changes serve as chemical signals that communicate the algae's health status to their coral hosts. Bright, vibrant colors indicate healthy, productive algae, while faded or unusual colors can signal stress or disease that requires immediate chemical intervention. The molecular communication between coral and algae becomes critical during environmental stress, like when water temperatures rise beyond comfortable levels. You're witnessing a chemical crisis management system that has evolved to handle these emergencies through sophisticated molecular protocols. When heat stress begins, the algae start producing toxic compounds instead of beneficial sugars, essentially poisoning their coral hosts rather than feeding them. This is where the chemical communication network proves its importance, because the coral must make a difficult molecular decision. They can chemically signal the algae to leave, essentially evicting their long-term tenants to prevent further poisoning. But this also means losing their primary food source. The chemical conversation that happens during coral bleaching events involves complex molecular negotiations, as both organisms try to survive what might be a temporary crisis or a permanent change in ocean conditions. Researchers still argue about whether the algae and coral truly cooperate, or if their partnership is more like molecular blackmail, where each organism uses chemical signals to force the other into beneficial behaviors. Some marine biologists believe the relationship is so integrated that the two organisms should be considered a single entity, like how humans couldn't survive without the bacteria in our digestive systems. You observe a section of reef where some corals have successfully weathered recent heat stress, while others have bleached white, expelled their algae partners, and now struggle to survive on their own. The difference often comes down to the sophistication of chemical communication between the partners, with some coral algae teams having developed more advanced molecular protocols for handling environmental stress than others. The chemical memory of this partnership extends back through geological time, with both organisms carrying molecular information about successful survival strategies developed over millions of years. When modern coral face new challenges like ocean acidification or pollution, they draw on this vast chemical database of survival techniques, using molecular memory to guide their responses to unprecedented environmental conditions. Remember those molecular messages you observed earlier, traveling between coral polyps? Many of those chemical signals actually originate from the algae living inside each coral, creating a communication network that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The algae essentially use their coral hosts as chemical transmission towers, broadcasting molecular messages about environmental conditions to algae living in neighboring corals, creating a microscopic early warning system that helps the entire reef community prepare for changing conditions. You shift your gaze to what most people would consider the invisible foundation of this entire underwater city, the bacterial communities that coat every surface of the reef like microscopic urban planners working around the clock. These aren't the simple bacteria you might think of from biology class. You're observing some of the most sophisticated chemical engineers on the planet, organisms that use molecular communication to literally build the architecture that supports all other reef life. The rock-like structure of the coral itself exists because of bacterial chemical communication systems that have been perfecting their construction techniques for over 3 billion years. Every surface you see, from the smallest coral polyp to the massive reef formations stretching to the horizon, began as a bacterial chemical conversation about where and how to deposit calcium carbonate. These microscopic organisms coordinate their building activities through chemical signals that make human construction projects look haphazard by comparison. You watch as billions of bacteria release specific enzymes into the water, molecular tools that extract calcium and carbonate ions from seawater and guide them into precise crystalline formations. This isn't random precipitation. It's controlled chemical architecture where bacterial communities use molecular blueprints to create structures that will support coral polyps for decades. The bacteria essentially serve as the concrete contractors of the reef, following chemical instructions to build foundations strong enough to withstand hurricanes and tsunamis. The chemical communication between these bacterial architects operates like a molecular construction site where different bacterial species specialize in different aspects of reef building. Some bacteria focus on calcium extraction, releasing chemical signals that attract the specific ions needed for construction. Others specialize in structural engineering, using molecular messages to coordinate the placement of building materials in patterns that maximize strength while minimizing weight. Still others function as quality control inspectors, releasing chemical compounds that test structural integrity and signal when repairs are needed. What makes this bacterial construction project even more remarkable is how they coordinate their activities with the coral and algae living above them. The bacteria receive chemical signals from coral polyps about where new growth is needed, then respond by increasing construction activity in those specific areas. They also communicate chemically with the zooxanthellae you observed earlier, timing their building activities to accommodate the energy production schedules of the algae-coral partnerships. You notice areas where the bacterial chemical communication has created specialized microenvironments within the reef structure itself. Some bacterial communities use molecular signals to create slightly acidic conditions that help dissolve old coral skeleton, making room for new growth. Other bacteria maintain more alkaline chemical environments that promote rapid calcium carbonate deposition, essentially fast-tracking construction in areas where the reef needs quick repairs. The bacterial communication network extends far beyond just construction activities. These microscopic organisms also serve as the reef's primary waste management system through sophisticated chemical coordination. Different bacterial species use molecular signals to divide up the job of processing organic waste, with some specializing in breaking down dead coral tissue, others focusing on fish waste, and still others handling the cellular debris produced by millions of microscopic organisms living throughout the reef. This bacterial waste processing system operates through chemical chain reactions that would make industrial engineers envious. One bacterial species releases enzymes that break complex organic molecules into simpler compounds, then uses chemical signals to notify other bacteria that these simplified molecules are available for further processing. The second group of bacteria takes over, breaking down the molecules even further and releasing their own chemical signals to attract a third group that completes the recycling process. Researchers still argue about whether these bacterial communities should be considered intelligent, given the complexity of their chemical communication and problem-solving abilities. Some marine microbiologists point out that bacterial chemical networks can adapt to new challenges, develop innovative solutions to environmental problems, and even appear to learn from past experiences in ways that suggest a form of collective bacterial consciousness. You're floating above what might be the most sophisticated chemical communication network on Earth, where trillions of bacteria coordinate their activities through molecular messages that travel at precisely controlled concentrations and timing intervals. These organisms have mastered chemical communication techniques that human engineers are only beginning to understand, using molecular signals to build structures, process waste, regulate chemistry, and maintain environmental stability on a scale that supports entire ecosystems. The bacterial-chemical conversations happen so quickly that millions of molecular messages are exchanged in the time it takes you to exhale a single breath through your scuba regulator. Each chemical signal carries specific information about environmental conditions, resource availability, construction priorities, and maintenance schedules, creating a real-time molecular management system that keeps this underwater metropolis functioning smoothly 24 hours a day. You begin to notice something extraordinary happening as the sun starts its descent toward the western horizon, a subtle stirring in the water column above you that signals the beginning of the largest migration on Earth. This isn't the dramatic movement of whales or the seasonal journey of sea turtles. You're about to witness billions of microscopic organisms coordinating their daily vertical migration through chemical signals so precise they make Swiss timepieces look unreliable. Every single day as twilight approaches, countless zooplankton, copepods, krill, and other tiny creatures begin rising from the deep ocean toward the surface in a coordinated movement that spans the entire globe. But here's what makes this migration truly remarkable. These organisms don't use visual cues or magnetic navigation like larger animals. They rely entirely on chemical communication to coordinate their movements with creatures they've never met across distances that span entire ocean basins. You watch as the water around you begins to shimmer with the movement of countless microscopic bodies, each one responding to chemical signals that originated hundreds of feet below in the ocean depths. The migration begins with chemical alarm clocks, molecular signals released by specific bacterial species that announce the changing light levels to organisms living in complete darkness. These chemical time announcements spread through the water like microscopic news broadcasts, reaching creatures that have no other way of knowing whether it's day or night on the surface. The coordination required for this daily migration defies human comprehension, with billions of individual organisms somehow managing to time their movements so precisely that the entire migration appears to move as a single entity. This coordination happens through cascading chemical signals, where early migrants release molecular messages that trigger responses in nearby organisms, creating chemical chain reactions that spread through the water like invisible dominoes falling in perfect sequence. You notice that different species respond to different chemical triggers, creating a carefully choreographed sequence of migration timing. The smallest organisms begin moving first, releasing their own chemical signals as they rise that serve as molecular breadcrumbs for larger creatures following behind. Copepods detect these early chemical signals and begin their ascent, adding their own molecular messages to the mix that attract krill, which in turn release chemicals that guide small fish and other predators toward the developing feeding frenzy near the surface. This chemical coordination system prevents the migration from becoming a chaotic mess where different species interfere with each other's movements. Instead, the molecular signals create what marine biologists call temporal partitioning, where different groups of organisms use chemical communication to schedule their migrations at slightly different times, ensuring that each species gets optimal access to food sources without overwhelming competition. Remember those bacterial architects you observed earlier. They play a crucial role in this daily migration by releasing chemical signals that help organisms navigate vertically through the water column. Bacteria living at different depths produce distinct molecular signatures that serve as chemical depth markers, allowing migrating organisms to determine their precise position in the water column even in complete darkness. The chemical communication during this migration isn't just about coordination, it's also about safety and efficiency. Predators release chemical warning signals that cause potential prey to alter their migration routes, while prey species use molecular camouflage techniques, releasing chemicals that mask their scent from hunting predators. The water becomes a complex battlefield of chemical warfare where survival depends on the ability to send, receive, and interpret molecular messages correctly. What makes this daily migration even more impressive is that it represents the largest movement of biomass on the planet, with more organisms participating than live in entire terrestrial ecosystems. Yet this massive undertaking happens through purely chemical coordination, without any central organizing authority or communication system beyond the molecular messages dissolved in seawater. Researchers still argue about the evolutionary origins of this coordinated migration, with some suggesting that the chemical communication system developed as a way for organisms to escape predation by timing their surface feeding to periods when visibility is limited. Others believe the migration evolved as an energy conservation strategy, allowing organisms to spend their days in the cold, low-energy depths and rise to the warm, food-rich surface waters only when necessary. You're witnessing a daily phenomenon that moves more biomass than all human transportation systems combined, yet it happens silently and invisibly through chemical conversations between organisms so small you need a microscope to see them individually. The molecular messages coordinating this migration carry information about food availability, predator locations, water temperature, current strength, and optimal feeding times, creating a chemical information network that spans the entire global ocean. As darkness approaches and the migration reaches full intensity, you realize you're floating in the middle of nature's most sophisticated traffic control system, where billions of organisms navigate three-dimensional highways through pure chemical communication, somehow managing to avoid collisions while maximizing their feeding efficiency in a daily dance that has continued for millions of years. You descend toward the seafloor, where ancient sponges create what can only be described as underwater cities, their bodies forming living skyscrapers that have been growing for centuries while maintaining chemical communication networks more complex than fiber optic cables. These aren't the simple bath sponges you might imagine. You're approaching some of the oldest multicellular organisms on Earth, creatures that have been perfecting their chemical communication systems for over 600 million years and show no signs of slowing down. The massive barrel sponge rising from the sea floor before you stands nearly as tall as you are, its surface covered in thousands of tiny pores that constantly filter seawater while releasing and detecting chemical messages from organisms throughout the surrounding area. This single sponge processes thousands of gallons of water every day, extracting nutrients while simultaneously analyzing the chemical composition of everything dissolved in that water, essentially functioning as both a living water treatment plant and a molecular intelligence gathering station. What makes sponges truly remarkable as chemical communicators is their ability to create molecular highways through their body structure that connect distant parts of the reef community. Water flowing through a sponge doesn't just get filtered, it gets chemically processed and redistributed with new molecular information added to the mix. Chemical messages entering the sponge from one part of the reef get amplified, modified, and broadcast to entirely different areas, turning each sponge into a biological relay station for the reef's communication network. You watch a small fish dart in and out of the sponge's internal chambers, and you realize these aren't just casual visits. The fish are actually participating in the sponge's chemical communication system, carrying molecular messages between different sections of the sponge's internal network, and even transporting chemical signals to other sponges located too far away for direct water-based communication. The sponge provides shelter and filtered water to the fish, while the fish serve as mobile chemical messengers for the sponge's communication needs. The chemical processing happening inside this sponge operates like a biological internet server farm, with millions of individual cells working together to analyze, store, and redistribute molecular information. Different types of cells specialize in detecting specific chemical compounds, while others focus on producing particular molecular messages. The sponge can simultaneously monitor chemical signals from bacteria, algae, coral, fish, and even other sponges, creating a comprehensive chemical picture of ecosystem health and activity. Sponges have developed chemical memory systems that allow them to recognize individual organisms that regularly interact with them, storing molecular signatures in specialized cells that function like biological databases. When a familiar fish approaches, the sponge can identify it based on its unique chemical signature and adjust its filtration and chemical output accordingly, essentially providing personalized service based on past molecular interactions. You notice that different species of sponges appear to specialize in different types of chemical communication, with some focusing on processing bacterial messages, while others concentrate on chemical signals from larger organisms. This specialization creates a redundant communication network where information can travel through multiple molecular pathways, ensuring that critical chemical messages reach their intended recipients, even if some sponges are damaged or blocked. The chemical communication between sponges themselves operates through molecular messages that travel incredible distances through the water column. Sponges can detect chemical signals from other sponges located hundreds of yards away, allowing them to coordinate their activities across vast areas of the seafloor. When environmental conditions change, chemical alarm signals spread from sponge to sponge like a molecular telegraph system, warning the entire sponge community about approaching threats or opportunities. Remember those migrating plankton you observed earlier? The sponges play a crucial role in their chemical communication by serving as molecular processing centers that clean and redistribute the chemical signals used for migration coordination. As the massive daily migration passes through areas with large sponge populations, the chemical messages get filtered, purified, and retransmitted with enhanced clarity, essentially providing communication infrastructure support for one of nature's greatest daily phenomena. Researchers still argue about the extent of a sponge intelligence, with some marine biologists suggesting that large sponges with complex internal channel systems might possess forms of distributed consciousness based on their sophisticated chemical processing abilities. The molecular decision-making processes observed in sponges often appear too complex to be explained by simple automated responses, suggesting that these ancient organisms might be capable of chemical-based learning and memory formation. You're floating above what amounts to the reef's central nervous system, where ancient sponges process and redistribute chemical information that keeps the entire ecosystem functioning coherently. These living communication hubs have been maintaining their molecular networks longer than any other complex organisms on Earth, serving as the foundation for chemical communication systems that support every other form of marine life you've encountered during this underwater journey. You drift through what marine scientists have discovered to be nature's most comprehensive memory bank, where the ocean itself stores chemical information from every major event that has occurred in marine environments over millions of years. The water surrounding you contains molecular records of ancient volcanic eruptions, mass extinction events, ice ages, and even the first emergence of complex life forms, all preserved in chemical signatures that continue to influence how modern organisms communicate and respond to environmental changes. The chemical memory storage system operates through layers of molecular information embedded in everything from sediment particles to the tissues of long-lived organisms, like those ancient sponges you just observed. Each major environmental event leaves distinct chemical signatures that get incorporated into the reef's communication network, creating a vast molecular library that organisms can access when facing similar challenges. It's like having a chemical internet with millions of years of archived data available for instant consultation. You notice how certain coral species seem to anticipate environmental changes before any obvious signs appear, and this prophetic ability comes from their access to the ocean's chemical memory bank. These corals can detect molecular signatures that match patterns from past climate events stored in the reef's chemical archives, allowing them to begin preparing for changes that might not become obvious to human observers for weeks or months. The coral essentially read the ocean's molecular history books and adjust their behavior based on what happened during similar conditions in the past. The most fascinating aspect of this chemical memory system is how it gets passed down through generations of marine organisms through molecular inheritance patterns that function alongside genetic information. Young coral don't just inherit DNA from their parents, they also receive chemical memory packages that contain molecular information about successful survival strategies developed over centuries of environmental challenges. This chemical inheritance allows each new generation to start life with access to their ancestors' accumulated molecular wisdom. You observe schools of fish whose behavior seems perfectly adapted to local conditions they've never experienced before, and this adaptation comes from chemical memory signals they receive from older fish in their community. Experienced fish release specific molecular signatures that contain compressed information about seasonal patterns, feeding locations, predator behavior, and safe migration routes. Younger fish detect these chemical memory signals and incorporate the molecular information into their own decision-making processes, essentially downloading survival knowledge directly from the water around them. The bacterial communities you encountered earlier serve as the primary keepers of this chemical memory bank, storing molecular information in their cellular structures and passing it on through rapid reproduction cycles that can preserve and distribute chemical memories across entire ocean basins within months. When bacteria encounter chemical signatures that match patterns from their stored molecular memories, they release specific compounds that help other organisms prepare for whatever environmental conditions created those signatures in the past. Remember those molecular messengers you witnessed traveling between organisms. Many of these chemical signals actually contain historical information rather than just current status updates. A single molecular message might include data about present conditions, predictions based on chemical memory patterns, and instructions derived from successful responses to similar situations in the past. The Reef's communication network essentially functions as both a real-time information system and a molecular time machine that allows organisms to learn from history. Marine biologists have discovered that some chemical memory signals can remain active in seawater for decades, slowly breaking down but continuing to influence organism behavior long after the original events that created them have passed. Areas of the ocean that experienced major disturbances like hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, or pollution events continue broadcasting chemical memory signals that help modern organisms avoid making the same mistakes that proved costly for previous generations. The chemical memory bank becomes particularly important during unprecedented environmental changes like ocean acidification or rapid warming, where organisms face challenges that have no exact historical precedent. In these situations, the Reef's communication network combines molecular memories from multiple past events to create new chemical guidance signals, essentially using historical data to develop innovative responses to novel problems. Researchers still argue about how much environmental history is actually stored in the ocean's chemical memory bank, with some estimating that molecular signatures from every major ecological event over the past 10 million years continue to influence modern marine communication networks. This would mean that every chemical signal you're witnessing carries information from an almost unimaginably deep well of historical experience. You're floating through a living library where every drop of seawater contains molecular stories about the planet's environmental history, and every organism around you can access this chemical archive to guide their responses to whatever challenges the future might bring. The Reef's communication network isn't just about present-day coordination. It's about connecting current generations to the accumulated molecular wisdom of countless ancestors who successfully survived whatever the ocean could throw at them. You find yourself in the middle of an invisible chemical war zone where predators and prey engage in molecular battles that make human espionage look primitive by comparison. Every organism around you is simultaneously broadcasting chemical signatures while trying to detect, decode, and sometimes jam the molecular signals being sent by other creatures, creating a complex landscape of chemical deception, camouflage, and counterintelligence that operates 24 hours a day. The sleek barracuda cruising past your position isn't just hunting with its eyes and speed, it's tracking prey through chemical trails that might be hours old but still contain detailed molecular information about the size, health, and stress levels of potential targets. Predator fish have evolved chemical detection systems so sensitive They can identify individual prey species, determine how recently they fed, and even assess whether they are injured or sick, all from trace molecular signatures dissolved in seawater. But the prey species aren't defenseless in this chemical warfare. They've developed sophisticated molecular countermeasures that would impress military strategists. You watch a school of small reef fish that appear completely calm, but they're actually releasing chemical compounds designed to create false molecular signatures that confuse predator detection systems. These chemical decoys can make healthy fish appear sick and therefore unappetizing, or create molecular noise that masks their true location and numbers from hunting predators. The chemical arms race between predators and prey has been escalating for millions of years, with each side developing increasingly sophisticated molecular weapons and defenses. Some prey species release chemical compounds that actually interfere with predator brain chemistry, creating molecular confusion that affects hunting coordination and decision-making abilities. Meanwhile, some predators have evolved chemical filters that allow them to ignore these molecular distractions and focus on authentic prey signatures. You notice how certain areas of the reef seem unusually quiet, with fewer fish moving around than in other sections, and this isn't random distribution. These areas are under the influence of chemical fear signals, molecular alarm pheromones, released by prey species that have detected nearby predators. These chemical warnings can remain active in the water for hours, creating temporary no-go zones that prey species avoid until the molecular danger signals naturally break down or get washed away by currents. The chemical communication between predators themselves creates another layer of complexity in this molecular battlefield. Different predator species use chemical signals to coordinate their hunting activities, sometimes cooperating to trap prey between multiple attackers, other times using molecular messages to claim exclusive hunting territories and avoid competition. Large predators can chemically mark entire sections of reef as their personal hunting grounds, releasing molecular signatures that warn other predators to hunt elsewhere. Remember those sponges you observed earlier? They play unexpected roles in this chemical warfare by serving as molecular intelligence gathering stations that monitor and redistribute information about predator and prey activities. Sponges can detect chemical signatures from hunting events, process the molecular information, and broadcast warnings to prey species while simultaneously providing hunting intelligence to predators, essentially functioning as neutral Switzerland in the reef's ongoing chemical conflicts. The most sophisticated aspect of this chemical warfare involves molecular mimicry, where some species have learned to produce chemical signals that perfectly imitate other organisms. Certain predators can chemically disguise themselves as harmless creatures, releasing molecular signatures that make them appear to be cleaning fish or other non-threatening species. Meanwhile, some prey species have mastered the art of chemical camouflage, producing molecular signatures that make them smell like toxic or unappetizing organisms that predators naturally avoid. Seasonal changes add another dimension to the chemical warfare as breeding seasons approach, and organisms need to balance reproduction with survival. Breeding fish release chemical attractants to find mates, but these same molecular signals can also attract predators, creating chemical dilemmas where organisms must decide between reproductive success and personal safety. Some species have evolved to release breeding pheromones only during specific times and conditions that minimize predator detection. The chemical memory bank you learned about earlier stores molecular information about successful predator and prey strategies, allowing organisms to adapt their chemical warfare techniques based on historical patterns of what worked and what failed in past conflicts. New generations of both predators and prey inherit not just genetic hunting or escape instincts, but also chemical knowledge about the most effective molecular weapons and defenses developed by their ancestors. Researchers still argue about whether some organisms might be capable of chemical deception so advanced it approaches conscious lying, with certain species appearing to deliberately release false molecular information designed to mislead other creatures about their identity, intentions, or capabilities. These molecular lies would represent one of the most sophisticated forms of animal communication ever discovered, suggesting that chemical intelligence in marine environments might be far more advanced than anyone previously imagined. You're suspended in the middle of nature's most complex chemical battlefield, where every breath you take through your regulator disrupts ongoing molecular conflicts that determine which organisms will eat and which will be eaten, all coordinated through chemical signals so subtle that human technology can barely detect them. You witness the ocean's chemical calendar shifting as seasonal changes trigger molecular transformations that coordinate reproduction, migration, and ecosystem-wide behavioral changes across millions of square miles of marine habitat. The water around you carries chemical signals announcing that breeding season approaches, molecular messages so powerful they can synchronize the reproductive activities of countless species across entire ocean basins with timing precision that makes human scheduling systems look chaotic. The first signs of this seasonal chemical symphony appear as subtle changes in the molecular signatures released by the coral polyps beneath you, chemical announcements that water temperatures have reached the critical threshold for spawning events. These initial molecular signals spread through the reef's communication network like chemical dominoes, triggering cascading responses that will eventually coordinate one of nature's most spectacular reproductive displays involving millions of organisms releasing their eggs and sperm simultaneously. You notice that fish behavior throughout the reef has begun changing in response to these early seasonal chemical signals, with many species forming larger schools, changing their feeding patterns, and establishing temporary territories in preparation for breeding activities still weeks away. The molecular messages announcing seasonal changes contain such detailed information that organisms can begin preparing for events that won't happen for another month, essentially receiving chemical weather forecasts that allow them to optimize their reproductive timing. The seasonal chemical communication system operates through molecular clocks that track not just temperature changes, but also subtle variations in water chemistry, nutrient levels, and even the molecular signatures of microscopic plankton blooms that indicate optimal feeding conditions for newly hatched larvae. These chemical timing signals are so precise that marine biologists can predict spawning events by analyzing the molecular composition of seawater weeks before any visible signs of reproductive activity appear. Remember those migrating plankton you observed earlier. Their daily vertical migrations become even more chemically coordinated during breeding seasons, as different species release molecular attractants designed to bring potential mates together in the vast three-dimensional space of the open ocean. The chemical signals used for seasonal reproduction must be powerful enough to attract mates from distances measured in miles, while specific enough to avoid cross-species confusion in waters containing thousands of different organisms. The bacterial communities throughout the reef respond to seasonal chemical signals, by adjusting their own reproductive cycles and chemical processing activities to support the massive increase in biological activity that accompanies spawning events. Bacteria begin producing specialized enzymes and chemical compounds that will be needed to process the enormous amount of organic material created when millions of organisms reproduce simultaneously, essentially preparing the reef's molecular support systems for the busiest time of the year. You observe subtle changes in the chemical signatures released by different sponge species as they prepare for their own reproductive activities, molecular announcements that will coordinate spawning events among sponges located hundreds of yards apart. Sponge reproduction requires particularly sophisticated chemical communication because these sessile organisms must somehow coordinate the release of their reproductive cells with individuals they cannot see, relying entirely on molecular messages to synchronize their spawning with others of their species. The seasonal chemical symphony becomes most complex when different species must coordinate their reproductive timing to take advantage of optimal environmental conditions while avoiding overwhelming competition for resources. Chemical signals from early spawning species provide molecular feedback about food availability and environmental conditions that help later spawning species fine-tune their own reproductive timing for maximum success. Predator species receive their own seasonal chemical signals that announce the approaching abundance of eggs, larvae, and newly hatched organisms that will provide exceptional feeding opportunities during spawning season. These molecular feast announcements allow predators to adjust their behavior, metabolism, and territorial patterns to take advantage of seasonal food bonuses, while prey species use chemical countersignals to coordinate defensive strategies that protect their offspring during vulnerable early life stages. The chemical memory systems you learned about earlier become crucial during seasonal transitions as organisms access molecular archives containing information about successful reproductive strategies from previous years. Chemical memories about optimal spawning locations, timing, and environmental conditions guide modern reproductive decisions, allowing organisms to benefit from the accumulated molecular wisdom of countless previous generations. Climate change has begun disrupting these ancient seasonal chemical communication systems as warming oceans and changing chemistry alter the molecular signals that have coordinated marine reproduction for millions of years. Some species receive conflicting chemical messages as traditional seasonal indicators arrive at different times or with different intensities, creating molecular confusion that can lead to reproductive failures when spawning events become mistimed or poorly coordinated. Researchers still argue about how rapidly marine organisms can adapt their seasonal chemical communication systems to accommodate changing environmental conditions, with some suggesting that the molecular coordination required for mass spawning events might be too complex and ancient to adjust quickly to rapidly changing ocean conditions. You're floating through waters where every molecule carries seasonal information that coordinates reproductive activities, spanning the entire marine food web, chemical signals so fundamental to ocean ecology that disrupting them could cascade through every level of marine life, from the smallest bacteria to the largest predators, fundamentally altering how ocean ecosystems function during their most critical reproductive periods. You find yourself contemplating the future of this ancient chemical communication network as the ocean around you begins to change in ways that no molecular memory system has ever recorded before. The water carries new chemical signatures created by human activities, molecular messages that marine organisms struggle to interpret because nothing in their millions of years of evolutionary experience has prepared them to decode the chemical language of industrial civilization mixed into their traditional molecular conversations. The coral polyps beneath you continue their chemical dialogue, but now their molecular messages carry traces of ocean acidification, chemical signatures that indicate the seawater is becoming more corrosive than any previous generation of coral has experienced. These new chemical conditions are forcing organisms to develop molecular adaptations in real time, essentially learning to speak new chemical languages while trying to maintain their existing communication networks that keep entire ecosystems functioning. You observe how rising water temperatures are affecting the chemical stability of molecular messages, with some traditional chemical signals breaking down faster than usual, while others persist longer than expected, creating molecular communication delays and misunderstandings that ripple through the reef's interconnected networks. The bacterial architects you witnessed earlier must constantly adjust their chemical construction techniques as changing water chemistry affects how calcium carbonate crystallizes, forcing them to develop new molecular blueprints for building reef structures. The migrating plankton overhead face chemical navigation challenges their ancestors never encountered as changing ocean chemistry alters the molecular landmarks they use to coordinate their massive daily journeys. Some traditional chemical signals now point in wrong directions, while new molecular signatures appear without corresponding meanings, creating chemical confusion that affects migration timing and routes across entire ocean basins. Remember those sophisticated predator-prey chemical warfare systems you observed? Many of these molecular strategies are becoming less effective as changing ocean chemistry interferes with the chemical detection systems that both predators and prey have relied on for millions of years. Some species are losing the ability to detect their traditional prey, while others can no longer chemically camouflage themselves from predators, fundamentally altering the molecular balance of power throughout marine food webs. The sponge communication networks face particular challenges as ocean acidification affects their ability to filter and process seawater, potentially disrupting the chemical relay systems that connect distant parts of the reef community. These ancient organisms must somehow maintain their role as molecular communication hubs while adapting to water chemistry that challenges their basic biological processes, essentially upgrading their chemical processing systems while keeping critical communication networks operational. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of observing this chemical transformation is witnessing the reef's attempt to develop entirely new molecular languages adapted to changing conditions. You notice that some organisms are experimenting with chemical communication methods never seen before, releasing novel molecular combinations that might represent the early stages of evolutionary adaptation to unprecedented environmental conditions. Young organisms show particular creativity in developing new chemical communication strategies, sometimes combining traditional molecular signals in innovative ways that create hybrid chemical languages spanning multiple species. These experimental chemical conversations might represent the early development of communications systems that will allow future marine communities to thrive in ocean conditions that would challenge current organisms. The chemical memory banks throughout the reef are rapidly filling with molecular information about these new environmental conditions, creating archives that future generations of marine organisms will access when facing similar challenges. Every successful chemical adaptation gets recorded in the reef's molecular memory systems, building a new library of survival strategies for the changing ocean conditions that appear to be permanent rather than temporary environmental fluctuations. Climate research suggests that marine chemical communication systems might be more adaptable than previously believed, with some species demonstrating remarkable abilities to modify their molecular signaling methods within single generations. These rapid chemical adaptations offer hope that reef communication networks might successfully evolve to accommodate changing ocean conditions, potentially maintaining ecosystem coordination even as individual species face unprecedented challenges. Researchers still argue about whether marine organisms can adapt their chemical communication systems quickly enough to keep pace with the rate of environmental change, but the reef communities you've observed demonstrate that evolution operates on chemical timescales that might be much faster than traditional biological adaptation, potentially allowing molecular communication networks to evolve in real-time responses to changing conditions. You're witnessing what might be the most significant transformation in marine chemical communication since the evolution of complex multicellular life, observing in real time how ancient molecular languages adapt to speak new chemical vocabularies that will determine the future structure and function of ocean ecosystems for generations to come. As your underwater journey draws to a gentle close, you begin to rise slowly through the water column, leaving behind the chemical conversations that continue in the depths below you. The molecular messages still flow between coral polyps, the bacterial architects continue their construction projects, and the ancient sponges maintain their communication networks, all carrying on conversations in languages far older than human speech. The reef's chemical symphony plays on without pause, each organism adding its molecular voice to a composition that has been developing for millions of years. You break the surface as the sun sets over the ocean, painting the sky in colors that somehow seem connected to the invisible chemical rainbows you witnessed beneath the waves. The water around you sparkles with bioluminescent plankton, responding to your movement, tiny organisms using light-based communication that complements the molecular messages flowing through the deeper waters. Even here at the surface, chemical signals continue their work as marine bacteria release compounds that help seed cloud formation, connecting the ocean's chemical conversations to the atmosphere above. The gentle lapping of waves against your body carries with it the same molecular information networks you observed in the depths, chemical messages that connect every drop of seawater to the global ocean's vast communication system. As you float peacefully under the darkening sky, you realize that you've been privileged to witness one of nature's most sophisticated information networks, a chemical internet that operates continuously, connecting every living thing in the ocean through molecular conversations more complex than human language. The reef's chemical voices will continue their molecular dialogue long after you return to the surface world, maintaining the delicate coordination that keeps ocean ecosystems functioning smoothly. Sweet dreams are floating through liquid conversations, where every molecule carries meaning, every chemical signature tells a story, and every organism participates in nature's most ancient and continuous dialogue between life and the living sea. End of script. Sweet dreams.